Hello, Chelan County. Happy February. I hope you enjoyed Valentine's Day. Today, we have a special guest. This is our first international guest, I realized, all the way from Canada. We have a friend of mine who is also an energy engineer. He has over 25 years of experience and has worked all across North America on utility projects, whether it's natural gas or electricity. So I'm very excited to have Dave Shipley with us, all the way from Ottawa. And in case you're wondering about his Canadian street cred when he talks about winter, he was born in Winnipeg and raised in Saskatoon. So he's got it covered, okay? If you have any winter questions, Dave is here for you. Hello, Dave.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi. I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm fine.
I,
Yeah,
I like I like your digs. We were joking about your background earlier, but
yeah,
I like it.
yeah. I have these virtual backgrounds that I use on other applications, but it's not allowed here. So you get to watch my daughter's bunk bed sit there in the background.
It's nice. It's a
You
look.
won't see her because she's 28 and she doesn't live in the bedroom anymore.
Okay, all right, cool. You could take it down at some point if you wanted to, but it's
Yeah,
good.
I suppose. Yeah,
So how is everything? You're in Ottawa now.
yeah.
How's life?
It's okay. Ottawa's kind of eventful. It's not really the sort of sleepy little place that it usually is. We've got some visiting truckers who have lots of opinions, but we're surviving.
All right, cool.
And most of them are not coming this far out of this downtown. So
I see. So they're like quarantining, if you will, closer to the
yeah,
parliament. All
yeah,
right.
they're kind of boxed in there.
All right, great. Well, I am really thrilled. We kind of are taking two different paths today. So we have some questions that people have on, winter and heat pumps and all of the tech that is in our homes as we try to stay comfortable when there's big snows and cold weather. And then there's a whole group of questions because I know a lot of your work relates to how in the world North America is going to transition our energy usage to being lower carbon in the future. So, if anyone is listening and has questions about either of those things, either winter or decarbonizing the future, Dave is a really great resource here. And I'm actually going to kick it off. We have a couple of questions that folks have already sent in. So the first one, I think is a great one to start with. Brenda was asking, what do you mean when we're talking about low carbon future or decarbonization? What are we really talking about?
Yeah. So every time we burn a fossil fuel, there's there's carbon dioxide that's produced, and it's a surprisingly large amount. Like if you burn sort of um, 14 pounds of a hydrocarbon, like a typical oil product or something, 12 of those pounds are carbon, and they combine uh, with with two oxygen atoms. So you'd end up with like 40 pounds of carbon dioxide coming off from burning this 14 pounds of oil. And that all goes into the atmosphere and contributes to the greenhouse effect, and we all know about that. So a low carbon future kind of begins with trying to get off coal, which the province I live in has largely managed to do, at least for electricity generation. And then you start to chip away at the fuels that are kind of next in line in terms of how much carbon they have in them as components. So oil has less of it is carbon than coal. There's more hydrogen in oil than there is in coal. And then natural gas, has more of a hydrogen component than oil does. And then if you want to really get beyond carbon, you have to get to fuels that have a net zero carbon impact. So an example of that is clean electricity, and you guys have lots of that. You have lots of hydropower in your area. and so that's a very low carbon option. And then the other ones that we're looking at, because we work mostly with gas companies, is low carbon gaseous fuels. And those include things like renewable natural gas that might be generated at a landfill from capturing the methane that's produced as things decompose. Or it could be from waste cellulose from the forestry industry, or agricultural wastes. So that's
So
called cellulosic renewable natural gas.
so it's about, instead of using things that we're digging out of the ground, it's about using waste
Yeah,
materials for natural gas.
yeah. So that's
Okay.
one option, and then another option is some kind of hydrogen. But if you're going to use hydrogen, then you can't use hydrogen the way most of the hydrogen we get at the moment is generated, because most of the hydrogen we currently get is made from fossil fuels and doesn't really reduce the carbon impact.
Mhm.
So you'd have to make your hydrogen a different way, either with a method that captures the carbon as you're making the hydrogen, or else by making it with hydropower or solar or something like that.
Hmm. Okay. So when we're talking about a low carbon future, it's transitioning towards, like, kind of down that ladder. You described like coal being pretty heavy in terms of releasing carbon, all the
Yeah,
way down to things like hydropower, where there's pretty nominal amounts of carbon being
yeah,
released. And so it's
yeah,
like going down the ladder.
yeah.
Okay. Well, then I have a question for you from Jerry that's related. Is there enough electricity for this?
Well, that's a really good question, Jerry, and I appreciate it. We don't know yet, I'd say, is the answer. Um, Let me give you a concrete situation. In this past winter, or in the winter that's not yet over, British Columbia set a record for the most electricity they've ever had to supply uh, ever. So the demand for electricity during a cold snap was higher than they've ever seen before. And I got to look at a little pie chart that I don't have a copy of it, so I can't throw it up on the screen. But it showed that at that moment when the electric grid in BC was just going flat out to supply all the electric heat people needed, the gas grid in BC was supplying twice as much energy. So that means 2/3 of what they were using at that peak moment was coming from the gas grid, and only 1/3 was coming from the electricity grid. And some of the electricity is generated with gas peaker plants. So, like we would have to at least, I think, triple the size of the grid to be able to meet the current loads that BC has, unless people can get a lot more efficient about how they use electricity.
Hmm.
And then you have cars. If everybody switches over to Teslas and everything, then you've got all that load to meet. So I don't know that it is possible, at least cost effectively, in the next couple of decades. And so my feeling is we kind of need to throw everything at this. We need all the solutions from all directions. So, let's decarbonize the grid. Let's try and electrify lots of things. Let's go looking for more renewable gaseous fuels to put through those pipes. Let's help people get more efficient in conservation programs. I think we need to do all the things.
Do all the things. Okay, so you spoke about BC
Mm,
and their rough winter. We've had a bit of a unusual winter as well, where we
mhm,
had some cold snaps. We had just a big dumping of snow that we had to dig ourselves out of for at least a couple of weeks. We still have remnants of snow about,
mhm,
which I know you have a lot more in Ottawa, but for us, this was a big deal. Our mountain passes were closed, the whole thing.
mm.
How do these things relate? How does what's happening up in BC relate to what's happening to us just down across the border?
Well, BC's had a lot of really extreme weather in the last year as well. They've had some severe cold snaps in places like Vancouver. They had floods that washed out all their highways for a while. So there were a couple of weeks. There were at least a few days where there was literally no route east from Vancouver where you could get to the rest of Canada. You would have had to go through the States if you wanted to get to the rest of Canada from Vancouver. And they managed to get one highway open after a while, but it's been really, really rough. So, it's one region in a lot of ways, and the weather um, looks similar on both sides of the border. I think your area kind of looks like the interior of BC in terms of weather.
Yep, we're looking like South Okanagan.
Okanagan, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I think Seattle and Vancouver have pretty similar weather patterns too. So you kind of know what's going on north of the border, even if you don't pay attention.
Yeah, yeah, and our grid is connected. You mentioned that the gas lines are connected.
Yeah,
Our
the gas.
river is the same river. It flows from Canada down to our dams. And
Yeah,
so we coordinate with BC to be able to make sure that all of the dams have the right amount of power, and yet we're not, flooding different areas. So snowpack from Canada all the way down makes a
yeah,
big impact on how much electricity we're able to generate here as well as there. So yeah, it's all interconnected. I think we like to forget about it. We have our big dams, we generate lots of power, more than we need, we sell everywhere. And I
yeah,
think we forget sometimes about this bigger picture of what's going on in our region, but also just in general across, North America and other areas.
yeah. And so you're talking about some of the physical interconnections, but there's also a financial interconnection. If if the Clean BC policy is to electrify as much as possible, and they even attempt something close to doubling or tripling the size of their grid, then that's kind of your grid too. They're connected, and if they can't make all the electricity in their province that they need, then they'll have to buy it, and then the price goes up in the whole area.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Which can be for Chelan PUD, that can actually be helpful because
Mm,
we're the ones that net generate power. So when wholesale prices go up, we get excited. And it's also one of the reasons why we're able to fund conservation and energy efficiency in the county is that everything we save here locally, we can then sell elsewhere where maybe it's needed more,
yeah, and
like
get a good
during a
price
cold
for it.
snap.
Yeah,
For
yeah.
sure.
Well, I don't know if any of your listeners are old enough to remember the Enron crisis in California, but prices of a kilowatt hour of electricity just went nuts, right? $100 a kilowatt hour or some crazy numbers like that. And there was a trading floor in an office building in Vancouver where they were basically uh, closing off their generators all night long and buying cheap power from everywhere they could buy it, and then opening the generators flat out all day and selling power everywhere, especially down to California. And it was the first time that any Canadian corporation had made more than $1 billion profit in 1 year. And it all came
Wow.
from that.
Wow.
So
No,
that,
it's crazy that you mentioned this. So Steve Wright, our former general manager, his very first day as the head of the Bonneville Power Administration was when rolling blackouts happened during that event. It was
yeah,
an eventful first couple of months for him.
I,
Not a good time to take the reins. Yeah.
no,
All right, I have another one. We have some net zero homes and high performing homes in the county that are coming online. Do you know if there's any in the north? I think that we often think of ourselves in Chelan County as the north, but there's a north or north. What
yes, there is.
what's going on up there?
Yeah, there are homes that are net zero in Canada, and there have been for quite a long time. I had an old family friend who lived in Saskatoon, who had a home, uh, two-story sort of residential-looking home in Saskatoon. Which, if your listeners want to know what Saskatoon's climate is, you go out to North Dakota, and if it's not cold enough for you, you turn left, and, and then you go up to Saskatoon, so it'll be nice and cool. Um, and his house did not have a furnace because the walls and windows and roof were so well insulated that they didn't need one. The house was heated by the appliances, the people, and the lights
Wow.
in Saskatoon.
That's insane. This is mind blowing. I mean, we're talking Canadian prairie
Yeah, and
and
that
there
house
was
was
no
built,
no heating.
and it was built in the 70s using and basically all they did was they had 16-inch thick walls, and they filled it with cellulose.
So it was just blown in insulation?
Yeah, and
Wow.
and it was basically like a 2x4 construction inside a 2x4 construction with an 8-inch gap in between.
Wow. Okay, cool. So there wasn't even like thermal bridging, which is fancy talk for when you have a 2x4 or a stud that then is not insulated between your
Yeah,
exterior and interior, but they separated it even
yeah,
more and were
they were
able to get it.
8 inches apart. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah,
Clever.
yeah. And then they
Okay.
had R80 in the attic and quadruple pane windows and all the things.
Okay, so in terms of, high performing homes, we're talking about the envelope, that interface between inside and outside. If you can make that super well insulated and control how much air is getting in and out through air sealing, that's the golden recipe. It's not about how efficient necessarily the heating is, because these folks didn't even have heating.
Yeah, I kind of think that way because insulation is a simple technology and there's not a whole lot that goes wrong with it, right? And it's a well-established old way of doing things, and it's not um, it's not fancy, and so it's not very glamorous, but it works well, and it doesn't go away. It lasts for 30 or 40 years, and you're kind of all set. Um, and and then it does. Then you whatever heating system you use is going to benefit from all the work that you did on the envelope. The challenge for us is the existing homes. Like I'm sitting in a
Mhm.
home that has 2x4 walls, and I only have one layer of 2x4s, so I only have the insulation in between them. And if you want to do something with this house, it's a big job because you basically have to strip off the brick and the siding and probably insulate, put more layers on the outside, and then put up new brick and siding because the house will be slightly larger and the old bricks won't fit. Um, and then probably excavate around the foundation and put insulation on the outside of the basement walls. And it's probably a $70,000 or $100,000 project, um,
Mhm.
and it would be good to do. But we have 12 million houses in Canada, and I don't. It's hard to imagine who would pay for all those projects.
Mhm. Yeah, and what is your experience? I mean, so I have a few questions that I think are related. One of them is from Jeff. He's saying, like, who's going to pay for this? Isn't it just going to make everything more expensive? So, and then another one that's related, Steven's asking, is this like a carrot approach where like we incentivize things, or do we start throwing down legislation? What have you seen in Canada with how these things are, I mean, how is it working up there? Who's paying for it and who's requiring it?
Yeah, so it's kind of it's gone very slowly here so far. So I don't think the answer to that is clear. I mean, there are utility programs that are happening, and they're paying for certain things, but they're regulated and required to only do things that are cost effective according to the way they're regulated. So in other words, in order for them to pay for incentives for a project, it kind of has to be cheaper than other sources of clean supply. And so there's certain projects they could undertake, but other ones that just aren't gonna aren't gonna meet that threshold. Um, so the probably the most success we've had here is with new construction, where you can
Mhm.
get at this stuff by code and standards. Um, we have brought our furnace efficiency up to a minimum of 95%. So um,
And is this mostly gas furnaces that are
yeah,
being run up there? Okay.
yeah, and most of BC has gas furnaces.
And
They
what about electric furnaces? Like, what about cold climate heat pumps? Or is there hope for these, even in the extreme
Yeah,
winters that you're dealing with?
yeah. I have friends who have cold climate heat pumps here in Ontario, which is actually colder than BC for the most part, except for northern BC, and they function pretty well. My understanding is that uh, they continue to behave like a heat pump down to about uh, minus 30 Celsius, which is sort of 15 below or something.
That's
Um,
pretty good.
yeah,
I don't know that
pretty
we've
good.
seen minus 30 in our
Yeah.
area.
So the thing about heat pumps is that eventually it gets too cold for them to be like a heat pump, and they start looking like resistance heating. They're what technically what happens is their COP reaches 1, and that's the same as a electric resistance heater. And it gets closer and closer to 1 the colder it gets. But most of them continue to be more efficient than uh, electric resistance heating down to, like I say, minus 25 or minus 30 Celsius.
Hmm.
Um, and so for a utility that has a peaking problem, they don't actually help that much because on the coldest days, they're behaving like electric resistance. But the rest of the time, when it's not quite as cold, they're saving lots.
Hmm.
And of course, if you're running them off a clean grid like BC or Washington, then they'll lower the carbon impact of heating quite a lot. If you're running them in Saskatchewan or Alberta, where quite a bit of the grid is generating electricity with coal, they might actually make the carbon impact worse.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, I guess I don't you don't think about that. We always think like electricity is electricity, but it really matters what's creating the electricity
Yeah.
to begin with. Yeah, for sure. Okay, I have a question from someone you used to work with actually, Hassan.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, Hassan is asking, do we really have to decarbonize all the way to 100% carbon free, carbon neutral? Or, is that last 10 or 20% going to be pretty hard and expensive? What if we were aiming for, 70% or 80%? Is that good enough?
Uh, I think that you're absolutely right. The farther you go into this, the harder it gets. Um, but we did a study uh, a couple of years ago for Ontario, and it was just before the current government came in. Um, so the previous government was interested in looking at strategies for reducing the carbon impact of heating commercial buildings and homes in Ontario. So we looked at all kinds of stuff. Looked at alternative fuels like hydrogen and renewable natural gas. We looked at conservation options. We looked at electrification, and for all the different sectors that use low temperature heating, sort of below boiling point of water. And what we found was that to get to the targets that Ontario had at the time for 2030, we could do all of that with things that paid off out of their energy savings.
Wow.
So in other words, the carbon savings were kind of free because the things you're doing are paying for themselves out of the, the bill savings, basically. Um, and it was only after that that when you started trying to get towards the 2050 target that you started to get into things that got more and more expensive. And we would sort of climb this cost curve where we were starting to pay $30 a ton for the tons of reduction and $50 a ton and then $100 a ton as we got kind of farther and farther along into it and doing more and more expensive things. But the thing is that by the time we were getting to sort of $100 a ton for our carbon reductions, it was sort of 20 years out, and surely there will be new things that will come along by then. And so I think you start working on the things that look good now and
Mm.
do as much as you can with those things. And then the targets that are farther down the road, you kind of work on other options and try and bring them along so that you have more choices of more attractive things you can do later. And will we ever get to 100%? I don't know.
That's a tricky one. Yeah,
Maybe, maybe
for
not.
sure. And I think your logic, whether you're talking about on the province or statewide scale or like a utility or even a home makes sense, right? You start with the low-hanging fruit. So before, and think about like the 90s or the early 2000s, like, we're going to switch out those incandescent light bulbs. And now LEDs are kind of all you can find out
Yeah.
there, and they use a fraction of the energy. And so it became super easy to remove these very inefficient light bulbs, the incandescents. Then
Yeah.
we had CFLs for a hot second, and then now we're at LEDs. I don't know if we can really improve on LEDs.
No.
I think
No.
it's a pretty solid way to generate light.
Yeah.
But for other things, like in terms of homes, generally the most cost effective or the like LED solution of homes is, yeah, like attic insulation. If you can access your attic,
Hmm.
that's a pretty easy way to improve the amount of heat retained inside your home in winter and heat kept out in summer if you can just increase the insulation. And
Yeah.
Chilean PUD will help you pay for that.
And the other great thing about it is that you can't send your attic to China and have it insulated and sent back. If you do stuff like that, you're employing local people to do local projects, and the employment stays where you are.
Yep, that's true. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, when you're constructing a home here and improving a home here, the
Yeah.
money stays. That's true.
Those are local jobs, and people always need jobs.
Yep. All right, here's one more question. So Maria is asking, okay, so we're shifting our energy, right? We're going down the ladder in terms of how much carbon is being generated by our energy sources. How is this going to impact low income families who presumably are already having a bit of a difficulty with their utility bills and things like that? If things become more expensive, these
Yeah,
are the folks who might be impacted.
absolutely. And I know that in all of the utilities that we work with, they're obliged to have low income programs uh, where the incentives that they provide are often 100% of the cost of the project. Um, and, in Ontario, there are also bill assistance programs that are operated through the province to help people with their utility bills. So, like anything else, the transition could potentially have a bad impact on low income families, and so we have to help people through it.
Yeah. I'll do a plug here because everything you mentioned in Ontario, we also offer. So if folks need help with their energy bills, they can contact us or the Chelan Douglas Community Action Council. And there's funds for immediate bill assistance. Like if you're struggling to pay your bill, there's funds for that. At the utility, we also have a fund that's totally by donation of other customers. So folks donate to, it's called Helping Hand, and that
Mm-hmm.
money then goes to folks who are having difficulty paying their utility bills, which can include water
Great.
as well. And then for low income help for actually improving homes, we have a low income weatherization program also with the Community Action Council, and folks can sign up there. And yeah, there's a team that goes out to people's homes and does a pretty deep retrofit of the
Mm-hmm.
home to make improvements that really change the comfort. I think that's the biggest piece.
Yeah.
When you have super leaky windows and perhaps ventilation problems that are causing mold and other things like that, yes, your bills go down, but more than that, it's just like a health and safety and comfort piece that gets
Yeah.
improved when you do these weatherization improvements.
Yeah. Kids will be
Yeah.
healthier. They'll be able to study better. Life will be better in those homes.
Yeah. And all of these you can find on our website, chelanpud.org/help. And if you have any questions, you can also just give us a call. We're excited to help folks that need it and get them hooked up with the right resources.
Excellent.
All right. Here's one. So we've heard about Hydro Ottawa. I've heard about it. They say that in 8 years, I don't know if they realized 2030 isn't 8 years, but in 8 years, they're going to be net zero at Hydro Ottawa, which is the utility company that serves Ottawa.
My city. Yeah.
Is this really realistic?
It's realistic for electricity companies in some places. I really have my doubts about Ottawa. I guess they could do it. Across the river from us, there's a province that generates almost all of its power from hydro. Quebec. That's right across the river from us. And if Hydro Ottawa sort of stopped getting their electricity supply from the rest of the Ontario grid and tried to get all of it from Quebec, I suppose they could end up being net zero. But it's hard to imagine how else you would do it. Ontario's grid isn't bad. It's relatively low carbon because we closed all our coal plants,
Hmm.
and we have a modest amount of wind and solar and quite a lot of nuclear. So the most carbon intensive part of our grid is the gas plants, and we just have a few of those.
So nuclear is part of your quiver that is going to help with decarbonization. Am I hearing that right?
Well, we're just not turning them off. We're not building any new ones, but we're keeping the old ones going.
Huh. Okay. Because you've heard of, like the newer style of nuclear and how folks are considering perhaps making more of like a distributed nuclear generation.
Mm.
I don't know where they're chatting about this. I haven't heard about anything more locally in our region, but is that a piece of the
You know,
pie?
the challenge with nuclear is it's so hard for anybody to get permission to build a new plant these days. What I call it is the banana syndrome. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, and and nuclear power suffers from that. So it's hard to imagine that they could put a new um, generating unit anywhere but at an existing plant, like sort of building on to the side of a plant that's already there. Because trying to come up with a new location where you'd be permitted to put one is it's hard to fathom. There's
Hmm.
nothing under construction right now.
Yeah.
It's also cost us a lot. Like nuclear has ended up being very, very expensive for Ontario.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's hard with these big infrastructure problems. I think projects. I think even like the giant dams and things that we have like that. I think we're a bit constrained in terms of the growth that we could have for electricity production by using nuclear or even hydro. And
Yeah.
so cutting back on our electricity usage or being more mindful of how we're using it becomes a really important piece. We can't just build more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now it's kind of a hopeful picture on wind and solar because their costs have continued to march down
Hmm.
inexorably, and it's been pretty impressive. That in some places, depending on the wind regime and the solar regime, it's cheaper to build a wind farm in some places than it is to operate a coal plant that you already have.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay. But I will say, being a part of a region that has a lot of wind farms, they are also suffering from banana syndrome, as you mentioned, because yeah, there are impacts for
yeah.
there is no perfect. We were just chatting before, like there's no perfect electricity source. Everything
No,
comes with trade offs.
no. So even like maybe the cleanest one of all might be solar on the roof of your house, right, where you're not using any land that you don't already have, and these things go on there, and I don't know, maybe they change how the snow slides off the roof, but that's about it. Um, but you got to make them,
Hmm.
and there's pretty intensive factories where those panels are built, and you got to mine the resources that go into them. So nothing's completely clean.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We're gonna switch now to chatting about houses. Okay. So
Okay.
Dave, tell me, Canadian style blizzard comes in, power goes out. What do you do? And don't bring the charcoal grill indoors. That is a hard no. So
That's
what
hard
do you
enough.
do? What tips and tricks do you have?
Mm. Um, yeah. So I think you
Snuggle the dog?
yeah, gather in one room. Use lots of blankets. Find someone who has power at their house and go there. A lot of people do that. Our worst example of that was before I lived here, but my parents lived here. I don't know if you will have heard of it, but Ottawa had an ice storm in 1998, and the power was off in some parts of Ontario and Quebec for weeks. and it was off in the central part of Ottawa for several days. And there were some people who had fireplaces. My parents had a boiler that, oddly enough, didn't require electricity to work. Yeah,
Okay. When was that built?
1910.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
That's a long life boiler right there.
yeah. It originally ran on coal, but by the time they were living there, it was on gas, and it was a gravity system that, like, the hot water rose and heated the house, and the thermostat operated off the static electricity in the gas line.
Stop.
Yeah, I'm serious.
Seriously? So, what Dave is saying is buy a very old house with a
Yeah,
very,
really
very,
old house.
very old boiler.
Yeah, so my parents' house stayed warm throughout the ice storm, and neighbors came over and got warm in their house.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, some people have generators, um, and people will do that kind of thing, and people gather with each other, and if one neighbor has the fireplace, they might go to the neighbors and say, "You can come over if you need to."
So, a Canadian style blizzard needs a Canadian style community.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You should know your neighbors.
Yeah. Okay. And know their heating systems. I've never heard of such a thing, by the way.
Yeah, with the micro voltage. Yeah, it was just a round thermostat on the wall, but it kept working.
That's awesome. It's pretty smart. Okay. What about on the flip side? So, believe it or not, Canada gets hot sometimes.
It
It
does.
gets hot, and especially
Yeah,
in the Ottawa Valley, it gets humid and
yeah,
stagnant air. What do you do in summer if it's super hot and humid? We're blessed with baby kiss and dry heat here. We got our high desert action, so it gets hot.
yeah,
We got up to 115 degrees Fahrenheit last June. That was a
yeah.
hot moment. And of course my AC went out. So what do you do?
Yeah, you probably heard about that little town in BC that set a all-time record for the hottest temperature in Canada ever, and then the next day the town burned down. So yeah, they've had some pretty extreme weather both directions in British Columbia in the last year.
Mhm.
Um, so we have air conditioning at our house, and when when it's um, when it's humid and hot, we just keep the house closed up and we run the air conditioning all day and all night. Um, and what we tend to do is cool the house off a little more at night when the grid is a little bit more. There's not as much demand on the grid, and the outside air is a little cooler, so the air conditioner operates a little more efficiently. And then we often will let our temperature drift up a little bit during the daytime so that the air conditioner is running less in the hot afternoon when the utility really needs the power. And if you had time of use rates, which some places do, where they charge you more money for the electricity on peak times, then that would be a good strategy for keeping your costs down.
Mhm.
And if you get dry, cool nights, then it's a really good idea to open your windows at night and let in lots of cool air, and then close up in the morning to try and use that cool air to coast through the day. But it depends how humid it is in your place, and I have a spreadsheet where I calculate that every day all summer, and, and
Like
tweet out.
wet bulb temperature
Yeah,
is
that's it. And I tweet out every day whether the Shipley household is going to be opening their windows tonight or keeping the windows closed and running the air conditioner.
That's
So
awesome. Can you give me
based
your
on
algorithm? I feel like
yeah,
Schlam POD needs to have a little tweet sesh where we're like, everyone open up.
yeah. So, but the thing is that I live in a place where sometimes the decision goes one way and sometimes the decision goes the other way, right? If you live in a place like Las Vegas, where most of the nights are cool and dry, most of the time opening the windows would be the right choice. If you live in Biloxi, Mississippi, where most of the nights are hot and moist, it would never be the right choice. But in Ontario, it can go either way, and that's why my tweet is actually useful to people.
And so when we're talking dry and cold, dry and cool, what's
Yes.
cool?
So anywhere below about 15, 16 degrees Celsius, so like 60-ish
Mm,
Fahrenheit.
okay.
Yeah, but it depends on the humidity. If it's really dry, it would be a little warmer than that, and if it's super moist, it might have to go down to 13 or 12 before it was worth opening windows.
Hmm. All right. All right, cool. Well, Dave, thank you so much. I'm going to do a last call for everyone while I ask you about a project that you used to do. So if you have any last questions about winter or summer, because Canada gets summers too, or any decarbonization questions about how North America is going to make this transition over the next couple of decades, drop them in the chat. I can see them, and Dave can answer those for you. So my question for you, Dave, is tell me about what was going on up in Nunavut. You did a couple of projects in the north, in the Arctic Circle,
Yeah,
uh, trying to figure out the possibility of sustainable housing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that project?
yeah. So I was in Iqaluit, which is the capital city of Nunavut, our newest territory in Canada, and they they have a chronic shortage of housing up there, with lots of people living in quite crowded conditions. So they wanted to build a new subdivision, and they wanted it to be as sustainable as they could make it, because they're very aware that in the Arctic, they're more affected by climate change than most of the rest of the world. Their temperature rise is about twice as fast as the average for the planet, and they're seeing huge changes. So they wanted to do their part to do as much as possible. And Iqaluit is basically a one fuel town, because they have uh, heating oil that's brought in on the barge every year to heat the homes and heat the water. And they have electricity, which is supplied by a bunch of generators up on the hill that run off of diesel. And number two, heating oil and diesel are chemically essentially the same. I think they're a different color, but other than that, they're the same thing. So uh, that's that's not coal, but it's still a relatively high carbon fuel, and so they wanted to be as efficient as they could. So they were looking at ways of making the homes more efficient, trying to incorporate renewables to the extent that they could, maybe mostly wind, because of course in the winter they don't get much sun there,
Mm-hmm.
um, and uh, and trying to arrange the houses in a sort of a way that would be conducive to people having good neighborhoods and stuff. And so neighborhood design was one of the big features of this design charrette that we were doing. I was contributing some modeling to show how much the various designs of homes would contribute to the energy consumption and the carbon emissions. Um,
Hmm.
One of
And
the
did
most
they?
interesting parts of it was the neighborhood design. We we workshopped all kinds of different arrangements of the homes and how the streets would be, and we had all these nice pictures up on the walls. And then we invited a group of elders to come into our workshop room and listen to all the presentations of the different groups, and then react to them. And there was an exchange of questions between us and these elders. And at one point, I had the opportunity to ask a question, and I said, "If you were doing a design charrette, how would you design this neighborhood?" And they went into this intensive discussion amongst themselves for about, I don't know, 8 or 10 minutes. And we were all just kind of sitting there watching this. And they got finished, and their spokesman stood up and said, "We are a maritime people. And while we appreciate all the work you've done and the nice designs you've come up with, we think our homes should be in rows facing the sea, straight
Oh.
lines." And everybody in the room kind of went, "Oh, duh. Maybe we should have asked the local people what they thought before we spent all this time."
Wow. So this community actually got built.
Yeah,
Did they face the sea?
I think they do.
Okay. This is
Yeah.
classic. Classic. I actually have a couple other questions here for you, Dave.
Okay.
All right. So Assad is asking, can you tell us about gas hydrate, methane, coal? What is it?
Classmates? I can't.
Clathrates
I
as an
can't
energy
tell you.
source?
I can't tell you about that. I don't know
Way
anything
to
about
bring it, Assad. Like we're just I'm like cold climate heat pumps, good, bad, ugly. What do you think?
it. No, this is one I don't know about.
Not sure? Okay. All right. Well, I have another one. This one's from Anne. Anne is asking, or she's saying that in addition to decarbonization, we also need to sequester existing atmospheric carbon to help us reduce the impacts of climate change. What projects do you think hold the most promise?
Yeah, it's an area that Fortis BC, my big client in British Columbia, is definitely exploring. And there's a company in can't remember which town they're in, Richmond, BC, maybe, working on developing a project that's just what you're saying. They pull the carbon right out of the atmosphere and then make things out of it. You know, soaps and shampoos and stuff. Um, so they have these things working at the lab scale and sort of small demonstrations. I haven't seen anything that's on a really large scale yet, but there's definitely a lot of work going on in the area. The other thing that's so I think that we'll see more from other avenues like electrification and renewable gaseous fuels, and maybe capturing of carbon on site when producing hydrogen or burning natural gas to capture the carbon in the emissions. But I think these projects to sequester carbon from the atmosphere are coming along, and I'm hopeful they'll contribute. And like I said before, I think we need all the solutions. We need to be trying all the things.
Hmm. And so you're saying that Fortis BC, the gas company up there, was piloting it, or they're considering, or
I
where are
think
they down that path?
I believe they're assisting with funding
Okay,
for this organization. That's
gotcha. So what's the timeline for something like this being more broadly used?
I'd be speculating, but I'd say it's probably at least 10 years out before it contributes a big chunk.
Hmm. Okay. I do have a related question to this one. And so just for background here, Dave does a lot of modeling for utilities to look at different scenarios moving forward. How could we get to lower carbon emissions based on different scenarios? And one of the questions that I received was related to that modeling, and was curious if you include agriculture or forestry, since these can be, in the case of agriculture, they can definitely be a major emission source, and in the case of forestry, that could be a good. Trees are a great way to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Can you tell us a little bit more about what kinds of factors you consider to help utilities understand how they can move to a lower carbon future?
Well, so in a very straightforward way, agriculture is definitely part of our modeling in British Columbia because there's a bunch of huge customers in the lower mainland that use natural gas to heat their greenhouses, and they use a lot of it. So that's definitely in our model. The other thing that's in our model is the conversion of heavy equipment to burn compressed natural gas instead of diesel. So
Hmm.
that could include forestry vehicles that are used to haul logs out and so on, and could include agricultural vehicles, although I'm not sure that anybody's looked at that yet. But that's so those are the things that are explicitly in our model. We don't have trees and their emission implications in our model. But you know, Environment Canada models that, and there are other entities that are looking at that side of it.
Hmm.
It's obviously very important, but it's just a little beyond the scope of what I'm doing.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. And so just in general, generally speaking, when you're doing these models, is it a hopeful outlook? Are these things that are realistic that we can do? Is this, or are we kind of
Yeah.
tell me something hopeful here, Dave.
Well, like I said before, when a few years ago when we looked at heating in Ontario, the things you would have to do to get to the 2030 target that they had at the time would all pay for themselves out of their energy savings. So to me, that makes it a pretty good story. And we also looked at the employment impacts, and there were all kinds of jobs that would be created in the process.
Hmm.
So that that sounds pretty promising to me. Uh, and in the British Columbia context, the electric utility is putting forward a bunch of scenarios in their planning of their resources for the future. Their the plans that they the scenarios that they support the most strongly involve lots of electrification. The gas company that we work with is putting forward their group of scenarios for various futures that might come about. And they have one scenario that looks at quite a bit of electrification, and they have another scenario that looks at a lot more of these renewable fuel options. Um, both of these two choices, these sort of two major paths, get pretty close to the targets that people are trying to get to by 2050 in the Clean BC policy framework. So I think we have options, and I think we need to try and come up with the best combination of things. It's not a situation where there's no way of doing it. It's a
Hmm.
situation where there's lots of choices, and we have to try and make the best ones.
That's a good position to be in, I guess.
Yeah,
Having lots of choices to get to a good outcome is far better than the alternative.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, I think that's it, Dave. Is there anything else that you wanted to share? I'm really grateful. You know, we spend a lot of time kind of focused on the home or maybe even the county, perhaps Washington state, and I
Mm,
appreciate your bigger picture view that you've brought in today because even if we nail this in Chelan County or even if you nail it up in Ottawa, the impact really matters with what we do as a whole. And North America being a really big contributor to greenhouse gases, I think our impact is a lot more than, say, other parts of the world. So thank you for bringing this larger view. Are there any other lessons that you think
oh,
we in
sure.
Chelan County could learn
Oh,
from your work or from what Canada is doing?
I don't know about Shielin County, but Washington State, you guys have a big port on the west coast, right?
We got ports.
You got ports. So the thing that was never on my radar screen until I started doing these projects in BC was shipping. And ships burn this horrible marine bunker fuel,
Mhm.
which spits out a lot of sulfur and a lot of carbon and a lot of other stuff. And they could burn liquefied natural gas, and it would reduce their carbon footprint by, or ocean print, I don't know what you'd call it. It would reduce their carbon emissions by about a third, and their sulfur dioxide emissions would fall to essentially nothing. Um, and it just was never on my radar screen. And the thing is, like you said, carbon emissions are everywhere and coming from everywhere. And uh, any, and it doesn't really matter where we reduce them as long as we do. So if
Mm,
ships are your best choice, then that's what we should be working on.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, or in our case, you know, being a hydropower producer, you know, as the premium for hydropower and other clean energy goes up, you know, we get to choose more what we do and what we fund locally. So we're starting to look at our solar incentive for just little local solar panels, rooftop solar in our county, and other things that they have the benefit to us of saving energy that then we can sell
Yep.
elsewhere. But like you mentioned, it's one thing that a homeowner can do themselves
Yeah.
um, to help with this transition.
All the
That's
small
great.
things add up.
Yeah, they do. Cool. Well, Dave, thank you so much for being our guest on the Power Hour. And for being a
Thanks for
good
having me.
sport with all of my Canadian jokes and puns that you may or may not have seen before this episode. And if anyone has questions that pop up, I might just send them your way. In terms of you have a lot of knowledge over the last 25, 30 years. I was looking at your career. I was like 1991.
Mm,
Oh man,
oh man,
Days of doing energy efficiency for a hot second.
yeah, yeah, and I'm not finished yet.
No, no. Dave has decided he's not retiring. He
So,
is just coasting and seeing. This is a really exciting time to be in energy. So thank you for sharing everything with us today.
okay.